Boa noite. Estamos iniciando a edição 158 do Terra em Transe e o programa de hoje vai ser um pouco diferente. Em parceria com o Núcleo de Estudos Transnacionais de Segurança, o NETS, vamos abordar a política de drogas, racismo e reparação. E para isso, o professor Paulo Pereira, membro do NETS, irá conduzir o programa de hoje em inglês, entrevistando o Dr. Kojo Koran. Gostaria de agradecer a presença de vocês, estou ansiosa para o programa de hoje. Hi, Kojo. It is a pleasure having you in our program today. Thank you. E passo a palavra para você, Paulo.
Thank you, Fernanda.
Obrigado,
Thank you,
Fernanda. Obrigado pela introdução. So, hello, everyone. My name is Paulo Pereira. I'm a professor in the International Relations Department at PUC São Paulo and the coordinator of the International Research Group on Drug Policy, NETS. So, Kojo, first, I'd like to echo Fernanda's words of thanks, of course. Thank you for joining us on Terra em Transe, one of the activities we planned for your time as a visiting researcher here at PUC São Paulo, funded by FAPESP through our Santiago Dantas graduate program in international relations, which is a partnership between PUC São Paulo, Unesp, and Unicamp, as well as through our professional masters in global governance and international policymaking. Kojo Koran is a writer, a friend, and a professor of law at Birkbeck, University of London. Born in Ghana and raised in the UK. And he now lives in London. He's the author of Uncommon Wealth, a powerful exploration of the British Empire's lasting impact, and the editor of another book called The War on Drugs and the Global Color Line, which I think it's a groundbreaking book on the racial politics of drug policy. So I think his work has earned awards and recognition in both academic and public spheres. And beyond academia, Kojo is a regular contributor to outlets like The Guardian, The Washington Post, and The Nation. And he has appeared also on CNN and Sky News. His recent publications on drug policy, mainly articles, include The Legalization of Cannabis and the Question of Reparation, which examines how legalization intersects with racial justice, and another article, Drug Prohibition and the Policing of Warfare, an analysis of the connections between drug control and militarized security practices. So, Kojo, I'd like to begin this interview asking you one question about drug policy and racism. So, you know, in Brazil, just like in many other parts of the world, drug policy has been marked by deep racial inequality. But here, in our country, this issue takes on an even more dramatic dimension. We had a system of slavery that lasted over 3 centuries and was formally abolished less than 140 years ago. So today, Black communities continue to be the primary victims of state violence associated with drug prohibition. And our drug policy, as you know, is extremely violent, selective, and racialized. So with that in mind, I'd like to hear your thoughts on a theme that's central to your work. What is in your view, the fundamental connection between drug policy and racism? And why is it so important to center this connection in discussions about drug policy? Thanks, Kojo.
Brilliant. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Paulo, for having me both in Sao Paulo and on this show. And thank you, Fernanda, and everybody who's helped put this together. Regarding the question that you asked of the connection between drug policy and racism and how can we understand it, I think I want to suggest 3 different frames that we can look through this question through. The first is structural, and you already alluded to some of the structural reasons why drug policy falls heaviest on racial minority communities, and that's not just in the United States, where people will be most familiar with, especially anyone who's read the work of, say, Michelle Alexander, not just in Brazil, with the numbers and the history that Paolo just mentioned, but also in the UK, where I'm based. We know that in the UK, government's own report in 2017 found that Black people are 240 times more likely to receive an imprisonment sentence for a drug offence than white Britons. We know this is the same when we go to Colombia. We know this is the same when we go to South Africa. We know this is the same when we go to many other jurisdictions around the world. There is a structural reason for that. Partly the legacies of racial capitalism leading to racial minorities being more impoverished, more excluded from the legitimate economy, more pushed into the illegitimate, the informal economy, as we might describe it, and therefore being easier targets and more focused targets for police surveillance, arrest, and ultimate incarceration. And so that structural material inequality feeds the inequality of application of drug laws, which on the surface are supposed to be neutral and objective. There is also a historical reason why we can see this connection. That historical reason is recognizing how indebted to languages of race the very first drug laws were. And they were coming, not long after that period of the conclusion of slavery in Brazil that you just highlighted. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, we start seeing the very first laws against what people call the big three drugs, coca, opium, and cannabis in the United States. And then we see, the really dramatic step, which hadn't happened before. There have been hotspot prohibitions around the world, but what's really different in the 20th century is that American project of drug prohibition is globalized. It's interwoven with international law, with institutions of international law, first the League of Nations and then with the United Nations, UNODC, INCB, all these other organs that police the drug war. And when we go back to the very first laws against drugs, we can see how much, whether we look at, Hamilton Wright, who was one of the first major American prohibitionists, his submission to Congress, it is wholly saturated and dripping with what in the 21st century we would call obscene, explicit scientific racism. Ideas that we need to prohibit cocaine because of its impact on the Negro mind, as he would describe it. Ideas of the prohibition of opium because it facilitates what he would call Orientals being able to seduce people, from the Native American population, or not the Native American population, the white American population. And so that historical legacy, I think, is really significant. And the third lens that I would offer is also one of ideology. The way in which the language of drugs has been used to construct a kind of symbolic and floating signifier of another, I think really maps onto how race continues to be the outside through which whiteness constructs itself. And here I've drawn the work of someone like Stuart Hall and his understanding of race as a floating signifier. Drugs become this metaphor for danger, for intoxication, for immorality, and for violence, as well as criminality. And this means that in the popular imagination, it is interwoven with communities and subjectivities that are also taken to encapsulate everything that civilized, rational white society says that it is not. And so that overlap ideologically between how we see race and how we see drugs also facilitates to that inequality of application of the drug laws that we see all across the world. Because it cannot be a coincidence that even though the laws are drafted in the same neutral objective way, when we go to Brazil, when we go to Colombia, when we go to USA, when we go to Canada, when we go to Germany, when we go to the UK, we still see the vast majority of people who are being punished for these laws being people of racial minority communities in these different areas.
Thanks a lot, Kojo. I think it gives us an idea, a general idea of the challenges of this connection and the urgency that it's necessary to face this aspect so sad of these links between racial disparities and drug policy. So the second question is the fact that we are witnessing a significant shift in the global landscape of drug policy. So across a growing number of jurisdictions, there is a move away from punitive approaches and towards models that decriminalize personal drug use and treat it as a public health issue rather than a criminal one. Even in the United States, uh, as you mentioned, the birthplace of the so-called war on drugs, we've seen major reforms, such as cannabis legalization in many states. So at the same time, in Latin America, one of the regions that we know that was most impacted by the war on drugs, countries like Uruguay have taken pioneering steps to regulate cannabis. And other countries, for example, Colombia, has recently called for an end to the global prohibitionist regime. So, in your view, what is the political significance of this global shift? And how can it help in addressing the deep rooted racism that has historically shaped drug policies around the world?
No, that's a really good question, Paolo. Um, in terms of the roots that I think underpin this shift that you mapped out, I think that the first route, which still isn't something that's accepted everywhere, this is an ongoing debate that I think that we need to emphasize, is the reason why jurisdictions are shifting away from the war on drugs is because the war on drugs has failed, and it's failed on its own terms. It set itself the target of creating a drug-free world as the United Nations held their General Assembly special session on drugs about in 1998. The idea of prohibition was if we police, criminalize, and punish the not just possession of drugs, but particularly the supply of drugs, eventually the demand would go down, rates of problematic addiction would go down, rates of dangerous diseases would go down, and ultimately we would move into this drug-free future. In fact, the opposite has happened. You know, more people are using drugs than ever before. 292 million people, by the UN's own calculation, in 2024 use drugs as now prohibited in international law. That rate is going up. We know that the rate of infectious diseases that are caused from drug use are going up. We know that the rate of dangerous drug deaths are going up. So the war on drugs is failing on its own terms. I think that's the first step that we do want to stop and emphasize. But then what comes after? You know, there's a famous saying in England that, you know, a bad general prepares for the last war, and a good general prepares for the next war. And I think that people involved in drug policy reform now need to start thinking about, well, what is the next law that's coming afterwards? Because in many ways, we could celebrate some of the legal reforms that we've seen. You know, legalization of cannabis now in half of all American states, legalization of cannabis in major states like Canada, Germany, you know, discussions ongoing in so many jurisdictions around the world, Switzerland, Holland, South Africa, legalization of cultivation in Ghana, you know, moves towards psychedelic legalization, even conversations of regulation around the coca leaf and its derivatives in Latin America. And there is a lot to celebrate with this. But I think we also need to, in relation to that question that you asked, of how can this deal with the issues around racism, we need to also be careful to ensure that the beneficiaries of these reforms aren't the same groups and communities that benefited from prohibition. Prohibition has devastated the lives of, as we mentioned, racial minority communities in the West, global South communities, indigenous communities, we need to make sure that if we are reforming these laws, we're reforming them in a way that can help those communities that were punished by prohibition. Because with legalization and with regulation, we're not just moving away from a system of punishment and incarceration, we're also creating a new, highly lucrative, multi-billion-dollar industry. And I think it's important to think about what are some of the instruments that we can use to try and shape this industry in a way that means all those people we talked about in the first question who have been imprisoned for the war on drugs, who've been lost their livelihoods for the war on drugs, who've had their farms destroyed through counter-narcotics programs, that they are put at the front of the queue with this new transition.
Perfect, Kojo. Yeah. On the one hand, I think we're seeing a revolution in a sense because lots of things are changing in terms of drug policy. But on the other hand, I think the challenges remain the same in terms of inequality, racism, gender inequality, class struggles, and everything. So I think it's exciting, but I think I totally agree with you that we have to be aware of the challenges that we are going to face in the next years to engage with this topic in a democratic way. So yeah, thank you very much. So another question related to this one, it's the issue of reparation, which is one of your main topics in the debate of drug policy. So it's something that you've explored in depth, particularly in relation to the global drug war and its racial impacts. But as you already told me recently, for many people, it remains this topic of reparation. It remains a misunderstood or even a controversial topic. Some see it as abstract. Others react with discomfort or resistance when the term is brought up, often without fully grasping what's really at stake. So, could you help us understand what reparations actually means in this context, and how can this idea be meaningfully applied to today's debates on drug policy reform and justice for communities that have been disproportionately harmed by prohibition?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right about the fear and anxiety that the even word of reparations can generate in so many people. And I think that's part of the challenge that any serious, not just drug policy reform expert, but people who are interested in climate reparations. That's a big debate that's going on. People are talking about reparations in terms of how we roll out technology, AI. I think that that's a big element that people want to discuss. So this is an area where drug policy can lead a much broader conversation. And I think that part of the fear that underpins reparations is how exceptionalized it's presented to be. It's often seen as this unprecedented moment of revenge, particularly when tied to plantation slavery, that leads to, at least in Britain, debates around, well, what about the Romans who conquered the British? Should we get reparations for that? And what about the Stone Age people? And I think a really helpful tactic that I have been able to use in my teaching and my public discussions is to just emphasize, take the temperature down, and stress to the listener that reparations is actually a relatively standard tool of international law. We can name multiple examples of governments engaging in reparative justice initiatives, whether that's the German government paying reparations not only to survivors of the Holocaust, but also recently to the survivors of the genocide in modern day Namibia. We can think about the Canadian government paying reparations to the survivors of their kind of Indian reservation schools programs. We can think of all the different transitional justice movements around the world, from Colombia to South Africa, that have contained some sort of reparative justice initiative element within them. And I think we can make people aware that this is something that is considered and is implemented at a transnational level, relatively often. So it's not this terrifying, once in a lifetime the kind of confrontation that I think people might imagine it to be. And secondly, I think people also imagine the reparations is only going to come in the form of kind of cash payments, that reparations will be, the government saying, I don't know, to every white person, you have to pay, £10,000, and that goes to the black person they see next door to them. And again, this is quite a shallow and relatively limited view of how reparative justice initiatives can be. Of course, sometimes there is financial compensation, and that can be quantified, as judges do all the time. But also, you can have a reparative justice initiatives. I was talking about designing the yes.
Yeah, you were talking about the second aspect of your answer.
Yeah. So the way that we design, especially design emerging markets like drugs, I think can have a huge influence on the way the reparations is actually implemented. And so we can think about things like giving licenses in these lucrative markets to particular communities that were disproportionately punished. We can think about giving ownership over different plant strains, using the systems of intellectual property and systems of patent monopolization kind of against itself by giving those instruments to indigenous communities to ensure that they are the ones who profit from any wider rollout of this particular type of plant medicine. We can think about registering seeds, in the name of particular communities that have cultivated them for a long time, so that as their spread expands, those communities are the ones who profit from that. We can think about how we can spend tax revenue on particular areas that might have been over-policed and under-resourced in order to ensure that they are the ones who are able to be, put back on a level playing field. And so I think reparations can be so much more nuanced and targeted than simply cash payments. And I think that often can, in fact, be more effective because it gets to transferring not just the income, but actually the wealth. If you can give communities ownership over things, if you can set up, social benefit trusts that allow people to be able to exert ownership over areas, then I think you can really transform the living standards of communities who have been oppressed for so long.
Thanks a lot, Kojo. Amazing explanation. I think it's very important not just to link drug policy to other topics that we can put together to debate this issue of reparations, but also the importance to deal with this topic looking at other experiences, as you mentioned. So to finalize to end this debate, I'd like to ask you about Ghana. You mentioned Ghana as an example of a country that are trying to develop new way to deal with drug policy. So I know that you are following the evolution of drug policy there. So in recent years, the country has taken important steps, like in 2020 law that shifted the approach from punishment to public health, and recent moves toward regulating medicinal cannabis. So how do you see the current situation in Ghana, and what promising perspectives or key challenges do you think stand out in this process of reform?
It's a great question. And one that I think is particularly relevant when we think about how drug policy reform is being implemented in the global south, in places like Ghana, in places like Brazil, in places like Colombia, as opposed to the usual focus on the USA and Canada. So in terms of the story of Ghana, this has been a dramatic shift in my lifetime. Ghana used to have an incredibly draconian approach to all drugs, and not only draconian in terms of policing, but heavily stigmatized socially. Ghana is an incredibly religious society. By some estimations, people consider it to be perhaps the most Christian in the world. And the demonization of drugs as being a moral failing, a moral sin that really was advanced by the war on drugs, is something that has been very much internalized and has been rolled out in Ghana for the past few decades. And so what we've seen in these in Ghana prior to the recent changes is people with substance abuse issues being left abandoned on the street, being discarded from society, being discarded from their families, and not having any of the harm reduction or public health initiatives that have now been undertaken. However, over the last few years, there has been a real shift by some absolutely fantastic advocates and representatives, both inside and outside the government, that have first of all spread a much more public health approach towards the treatment of drug use. And then in 2023, after a few years of back and forth, they finally passed a law that legalized the cultivation of industrial hemp and low levels of medicinal cannabis, with the idea for Ghana to export that to the growing medicinal cannabis market in places like Europe and North America. And so that has just now been implemented. The legislative instrument has been drafted, which details how cultivators, farmers, who are used to farming, whether it's cocoa for chocolate or whether it's cassava, whether it's plantain, they can now apply for a license in Ghana and get a license to legally cultivate cannabis. This is now being implemented, but the challenge that you asked me of what Ghana faces is how can they make this new emerging industry, which there's so much hype and excitement and speculation about, the government saying that it might bring in as much as $1 billion annually into the local Ghanaian economy, but how can we ensure that that $1 billion actually goes to the farmers and cultivators who are doing the hard work of, growing the plants and cutting them down and waking up at 6 in the morning, rather than what we've seen with other raw materials that Ghana cultivates. Ghana is the second largest cocoa chocolate producer in the world, but not very much of that money actually makes its way down to the farmers on the ground. You have the price being determined largely by international forces. You have the cocoa board at the state level ensuring that it sets a price that keeps Ghana's cocoa internationally competitive. And you have the farmers on the ground doing the heavy lifting, not having a lot of autonomy, control, or profit from their labor. Is that going to be the same story with the new medicinal cannabis initiative? Or is there ways that we can learn from what's happened in these other industries and draft something new, which can then in turn set a standard that those other industries will hopefully be forced to have to maintain? If we can create a supply chain which ensures that a lot of that value is transitioned to the people who are doing the work on the ground in cannabis, then why can't we do it with cocoa or with gold, which Ghana is another producer of, or cassavas, or any other major crop that is cultivated in not just Ghana, but also places like Brazil too. So that would be my hope, but there's a lot of hard work to do before that is actually made into a reality.
Sure. So, Kojo, brilliant participation. I really like to thank you for sharing your thoughts on this very important topic. As you mentioned, not just for Brazil, for America Latina, for Latin America, but also, of course, for Africa, places like Ghana and South Africa and many others that are trying to find ways to deal with this topic in another perspective, an approach that is less focused on violence and repression and more on public health and social justice. So thanks a lot. And now we're going back to Fernanda. Fernanda, are you there?
Yeah, sure. Thank you, Kojo. I learned a lot here. Obrigada, Paulo, muito. O Jesse agradece. E o nosso tempo, infelizmente, acabou. Eu agradeço também o apoio da TV PUC na condução desse projeto. E é isso, a gente se vê na próxima semana. Não esqueçam de nos seguir nas redes sociais, @JessPUC, para acompanhar os próximos programas. E até. Thank you again.